can they cover the entity that's responsible for their salaries fairly, honestly, and with the vigor that job demands. This segment is brought to you by Eastside Weight Loss Clinic. I'm down 37 pounds on the program, and I lost most of that weight in just 2 months. There's no prepackaged meals, no counting calories, no drugs or injections. Schedule your free 15-minute consultation today at eastsideweightlossclinic.com. We've talked about this on the show before, about the fact that there was millions of dollars appropriated by the legislature, Democrats in the legislature, to fund community journalism, essentially. They looked at, and this is a truth, that newspapers across the state are dwindling. You have some news deserts where localities aren't getting any sort of news coverage at all. You've even had layoffs at some of the larger newspapers. And so that just shows, for the smaller newspapers that serve more hyper-local communities, it's really difficult for them to survive. So yeah, we have fewer and fewer journalists by the day in Washington state. Now, I don't believe that's a job for the government to fix, fundamentally. And in fact, the government's the last one that should be fixing that. And so I have said that I found it really problematic that our state is doling out millions of dollars in taxpayer funds for what amounts to state-funded journalists. I think that's completely contrary to the idea of a free press and the idea of the press having to be a check on the government's power. So we're supposed to check the power of the people who are giving us money to do our jobs. You see the inherent conflict there? Now, whether you realized it or not, a newspaper near you probably is being supported in some way by a journalism fellow being funded by taxpayer dollars. The Spokesman Review, the Tri-City Herald, the Kitsap Sun, the Yakima Herald Republic, the minor newspapers, the Columbian, Chinook Observer, the Leader, the Wenatchee World, and various other newspapers are in some form or fashion benefiting from these state-funded journalism dollars. It could be that they have a journalism fellow who's on their staff being funded by taxpayers to write stories, or it could be that there's some sort of cooperation there to do some journalism funded by this money. Now, some of it I will acknowledge. Some of it is very mundane. The idea that this was pitched is to solve these sort of information deserts. So, for a local community that relies on its local newspaper to cover hyper-local things that the Seattle Times isn't covering, that the big news TV stations aren't covering, to sort of fill the gap there. And these things are mundane, and I think they're harmless so far as like the stories themselves go. For instance, I just pulled a couple of the headlines that have been published by these journalism fellows in newspapers or news entities across the state. Let's see. PUD approves wildfire plan and more public meetings. Okay, that's great. Let people know about public meetings. Bird rescue to host open house for the first time in 6 years. All right, see, very hyper-local. Yakima County has second lowest voter turnout in state as election results certified. Mapton School District to search for a new superintendent. Young Washington voters say cost of living is their top concern. So again, those stories individually don't really bother me. And I do believe there's something to be said about hyper-local news and it being the best way to actually serve people, to let them know what's happening on their local school board, on their local city council, to let them know how their money's being spent, to let them know about fun things that are happening around their communities. I don't have an issue with those sorts of stories. Now, I do have an issue with any form of state-funded media except for public access, like the C-SPAN and the TVW, because basically you're providing video access that actually adds transparency to government functions like meetings and like votes and things like that. So if it were just, and again, I'm opposed to it, but if it were just funding these hyper-local newsrooms to cover hyper-local issues, keep people informed about meetings and all of these things, and hold local leaders accountable for whatever, I might not be as hot and bothered by it, okay? But here's what's happening now. The state-funded journalism program is going to be sending 3 state-funded reporters to Olympia to cover the upcoming legislative session. Now, I think it remains to be seen what kind of coverage they're going to roll out. And so basically they'll be housed within certain newsrooms, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But that to me goes beyond we're just trying to account for a news desert in like far northeastern Washington or out on the coast. Now it's you're going to have state-funded journalists covering the legislature and the legislative session, and what happens there impacts the entire state, obviously. But one of the things I would point out is there's so few journalists who aren't funded by the government who are dedicated to Olympia, right? I mean, that number used to be like 20, and now it's just a couple. So now the state-funded journalists will almost outnumber the non-state-funded journalists that are covering the legislative session. And of course, the chief question is, can they cover the entity that's responsible for their salaries fairly, honestly, and with the vigor that that job demands? This is from our friends at the Linwood Times. 3 Murrow News Fellows will be sent to Olympia to cover the 2025 legislative session. The fellows, whose salaries are financed through a $2.4 million apportionment in state funds, will be responsible to hold state politicians up to scrutiny. The Linwood Times points out that one of the entities that is going to get one of these journalism fellows embedded in their newsroom is the Washington State Standard. Now, I think the Washington State Standard has actually been doing pretty good work. Jerry Cornfield, who used to be with the Everett Herald, the State Standard is fairly new, and I think it has served an important role down there, but it hasn't been a government-funded entity. But now it is accepting in a government-funded, state-funded journalism fellow. So the Linwood Times talked to the editor-in-chief of the State Standard, Bill Lucia, who we've reached out to today as well with some questions. Though some share concerns about state-sponsored journalists covering state politics, Standard editor-in-chief Bill Lucia states that organizers of the program have been deliberate and adamant that these positions will have total editorial independence. So again, TBD if what total editorial independence will look like. But part of that is not necessarily in the stories that they write, but in the story selection. So as an example, a lot of these newsrooms across the state, these newspapers in particular that are benefiting from these state-funded journalism fellowships, they had very uncritical coverage of Bob Ferguson throughout the entirety of the election. And I'm not talking about the journalism fellows themselves, I'm talking about the newspapers as a whole. These newspapers across the state whose editorial boards endorsed Bob Ferguson, who didn't pick up on any of the dozens of controversies surrounding Bob Ferguson and his campaign, his issues with public records, his request that the Secretary of State violate election law. So you have these newspapers who've shown us for the last 2 years that they have no interest in holding Bob Ferguson accountable. Their editorial pages endorse Bob Ferguson for governor, and they're benefiting from state dollars to fund their journalism. And now we're going to send journalism fellows who are part of that program to cover Bob Ferguson in the legislature? Forgive me, but I don't have a lot of faith in that. And it is also, again, not the role of the government to keep the media afloat. Fundamentally, this is part of the media being completely unwilling to understand why it's failing, why there are so many layoffs, why newsrooms are shrinking and shrinking until they disappear. It's because they're not serving their constituents in the way that their constituents want or need to be served. We talk about it all the time. That's why we exist. Do you really believe that we could do this as a full-time job if the old media and the mainstream media was firing on all cylinders and was holding people accountable and was doing the kind of reporting that people needed to hear? No, of course not. So there's a reason why there's been this huge movement toward independent media and why some of those independent media outlets can survive financially at a time when these massive legacy media outlets cannot. So all this is putting a piece of tape over the gash in the Titanic. All it's like, Titanic hit an iceberg, let's put a piece of Scotch tape over it and hope it holds. That's all it is. It is delaying the inevitable, because either the legislature continues to fund to the tune of millions of dollars a year these journalism fellowships, or they don't, and those journalism fellowships go away, and the media outlets are no better off because they haven't learned anything about why they needed a state-funded journalism fellow in the first place. And I would also say, Democrats, I'm sure they'll say, and they'll come out and say, this isn't, they have complete editorial control. We want them to cover us rigorously in Olympia. We know how some of these politicians are. We know how thin-skinned Bob Ferguson is. We know how precious he is about his reputation and about criticism. And the same would go for a lot of members of the legislature who we've talked about on this show. You really think they're going to be as eager, especially when they're facing a $10 to $12 billion budget deficit, to continue to sign off and appropriate funds to fellows who are doing some pretty scathing reporting on them, who are holding them accountable for their budgeting failures, for their failures to address public safety, to address homelessness? You really think if Bob Ferguson screws up royally and these journalism fellows are all over it, that Bob Ferguson's going to want to sign off on millions of additional dollars going to journalists who are holding him accountable for not doing his job? Of course not. And therein lies the problem. Therein lies the conflict. Now, it's happening, one way or the other. Again, Nicole reached out to the Washington State Standard this morning to ask some fair, legitimate questions about, the conflict here and whether viewers and readers can actually trust this information that's being put out. And that they're not going to hold back because they want to make sure they get this funding again. So we'll see. And I think we should invite Bill Lucia on the show. I think that if he wants to talk about these things, I'm totally open to having that conversation. But we've seen in this last election how important the media is. And when the media fails, Washington State fails. And the lack of attention to Bob Ferguson's record, the dishonesty that was spewed about the initiatives that the media just never really felt compelled to correct the record on. And so the media is really important, and the legacy media in this state is in a bad place. And if anyone thinks that adding state-funded journalists to the equation is going to make things better, I got news for you. It's not.